and we jump right in with the first topic, which is what does disruption really mean? And I know Ralph wants to start this one.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those topics, because we talk about digital disruptions everywhere these days, and the more I think about it, the more I come to understand that disruption is mainly technology based. So we make advancements and we get better at stuff and we leverage it. But why do we then talk about disruption? Because if our technology is becoming better, why are we not enabled by it? Why don't we think that's a positive thing? I can do something I couldn't do 5 years ago. And why are companies then concerned about digital disruptions? And this is kind of, I'd like to hear other opinions about that as well.
Hey, and Mary and Tom want to go next, obviously.
So I think the companies that are worried about disruption are the ones that are frozen in a moment in time and committed to a business model that the disruption is going to eat up. So, for example, if you were a filmmaker and digital photography took off around the year 2000, guess what? 10 years later, you'd be just about bankrupt. That's disruption for the film. And we see, I don't know how many times I've seen digital technology take over some existing technology, and the biggest companies in the old technology are incapable, because they're doing so well with their old business model, of switching to the new digital business model.
I think the big disruption is external, not internal. Internal is something, a matter of choice, what technologies you use to achieve your goals. The relevance of the goals changing is the real disruption. The example, one close to Joe, for example, electrification of vehicles, extraordinarily large disruption. That little company out in Fremont that is now worth more than General Motors by the stock market's measures, that's disruption.
Okay.
Okay, so Joe is manifesting his agreement. Any comment?
So, I mean, for me, if I could just follow up on that, is would you also say that disruption is, if you are, gosh, I totally lost my thread right now. I was raising my hand and technology, so I just drove out again. So I'll bring it back later on. Sorry about that, guys.
Let's hear from Patricia then.
So I think when we think about digital disruption, there's absolutely, the way that industries have been disrupted is, from a consumer perspective, a beautiful thing, right? So it's awesome that, on a general day, I can pick up my phone, I can leave you guys, and I'll get a car and I'm going to go somewhere, minus COVID. But what I think is really interesting to think about now, there are a lot of disruptions in different industries and businesses, but it's just also about the disruption that's happening to us from almost a living standpoint, a psychological standpoint. So this fact that there's so much power in what we've done with computers and technology, but yet, our brains haven't, there's no more capacity, or they're not better processing anything better than they were before. But it's this notion of disruption in our lives and in how we function as societies, because we're so addicted to this, what can we, I'm really thinking about that. How are we living? Right. And it's becoming interesting in terms of politics, in terms of health, in terms of what's true, in terms of what's not. And it's almost like that sort of disruption that is very dangerous, but yet very interesting. So technology's enabled us to do some really easy and cool and fun things, but there's this notion, I talked a lot about outcomes, of how much are we pushing on those outcomes, and is that a good thing? But electric cars all day long.
So Joe, anything you would like to add? Because you are waving your hands in agreement, but I'm interested in hearing from you as well.
Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate it. I love the idea of what change do we wish to manifest in the world, to live the type of life, the type of future we're most interested in. And change is disruption. Which do we pick? What are we most interested in? What types of change and disruption do we want to support? And I proposed a question to the panel, which is almost the same question with a different couch, a different setting around it, which is what kind of companies are making the change? So now I'll say disruption that we want, that we desire more of. And what can we do to attract them to Poland? And what can we do to build them up in Poland so they create many more of the types of jobs we want to enjoy? So that way we're not passively receiving disruption, but we're actually proactively making a backlog and prioritizing the disruptions we wish to exist in the world and supporting them with each iteration of our work, of our lives.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Any of you guys want to comment on that?
I've never thought about how I want to be disrupted. This is amazing.
So the tricky thing about disruption is it's all fine and good when you are the disrupting, but when you are the disrupted, it doesn't feel well because you worked for something for a long time and you have this feeling that someone is taking that away from you. Yeah. Ralph, you want
So
to?
I think that, I mean, for me, disruption, like changes, and Patricia just really showed the phone is like, wow, the first time you look at it, it's like, wow, this is magic, this is amazing, and you're really taken away by it, and then you start to use it, and maybe some things get better, other things change to some other degree. But I also think is that the thing about disruption is also like the technology. Are you driven by the technology behind that, or are you actually driving the technology? Are you finding the angle about using that to say, hey, I just discovered something new and I think we could leverage that for something different, better for certain circumstances?
Yeah. Joe, go ahead.
Artificial intelligence developers got really excited earlier in the year. A technology stack from OpenAI was released called GPT-3. And what GPT-3 actually does is fairly humanistic relative to what had been before language processing, understanding word groups and putting some context around them, and then producing word groups and putting some context around them. But that's not the really exciting thing. The really exciting thing is the progress of that engine from its roots playing video games against humans until it was winning, until it was achieving what's called state-of-the-art SOTA. So it's the best possible way anyone's found so far to complete a given puzzle where the parameters are knowable to the computer. That is so dramatically superior in GPT-3 that people who study this space, artificial intelligence, programmers, developers, company owners, investors, wrote things like, I feel like I've just seen electricity for the first time. I don't know what it's going to do, but I'm impossibly excited. Now, when you have a technology stack that gets people who are highly educated and highly informed, is a stance that I'll take, that some of these people are, and they have a reaction like that, you can say there is a change. What do I want to do with this change? Is this a disruption? Is this a positive disruption? Is this a negative disruption? And maybe I'm a strange type of human, but that is all I want in the world. If I woke up and the day was just as comfortable as yesterday, I'd be bored out of my mind. And maybe that's why I'm a technologist. Maybe that's why I went to work at Tesla. I'm drawn to these things. And the intersection between GPT-3, which is primarily linguistics, and robotics control is possibly one of the most interesting things I'm going to experience in my entire life. And it's happening this year. I love this stuff. I can't wait for more. I just hope it's healthy and respectful of the values we think are important as a global society. And if I want that to be true, I've got to get involved. Luckily, I like this stuff, but I hope a lot of people do too, and they bring their values with them.
So let's hope there is something even more exciting, like 2-3 years down the road, for you to get still the kick out of living. Mary and Tom, do you want to comment on that before we move on to some other topics?
I had my hand up, but I took it down because I just loved what Joe just said, and I don't know if I can add a lot more to it.
Cool. So that somehow plays to the question that Joe raised, and we just slipped into other topic, into finishing the disruption, which is what kind of companies we would like to build, or we think are worthy attracting to our country, whatever that is, or which is an interesting notion, because attracting means that it must necessarily come from outside. That's an interesting point. But anyway, so the companies who would think worth it to work for, what those companies would be from our own perspective. How would an ideal company look like? Joe, maybe you can take that, because that's your topic in a sense.
I'd actually really like to hear this from Mary and Tom.
Okay. I would really like to say something about that.
Cool.
What I try to encourage everybody in any company, any country that I go to think about is not how to attract great companies, but how to grow inside great companies. And I have been in an awful lot of countries that started out as outsourcers. Okay, fine. Somebody else is telling you what to do, and that might be a way to get started. But what you're looking for is to be able to think for yourself, understand the technologies, and solve the problems in your country with the technologies as they come along. That's where just about every great company around comes from. And so I think Joe has just mentioned a very impressive technology. I worked with intelligent robotics back many years ago, and believe me, they're way better now. But yeah, and that's definitely going to be something important. Now, what are we going to do about it? Who in Poland I just love the way people in Poland pick up great ideas and run with them, more so than most in the other country. I always say, watch out for Poland, because they have such great people. You have great people in Poland, you need to figure out how to take good ideas like what Joe just presented and say, where can we leverage that in our world? For heaven's sake, he lives over there, many time zones away. It isn't even light in his country, in his area right now. And here in Poland, here in Europe, what can we do with that? It's going to make our lives better. That's going to do some disruption of something else and make things much more interesting. So I really think that it's okay to get started by having some other place come in and give you some interesting work to do to get going. But it's time to make a switch and say, what ways can we make our world, our country right here better with the technology that we see? I did have one other comment. You talked about the phone, Patricia, but when I was a kid, we didn't have television. And let me tell you, TV was as radical a change as a phone is. So it's my second radical change. And the phone was going to mess up all our kids' minds and make them all dumb and destroy the world, because everybody could see what was going on instead of having to read about it. And it had so many things that it was going to kill. And we survived the television, and we're going to survive the phone, and we're going to do something interesting with artificial intelligence. I'm not quite sure what, and it might very well be extraordinarily dramatic, but maybe it's going to help us figure out how to make way better use of energy, for example, or whatever it is that we really need.
It's a big change.
Yeah, let's hope that's not that's the first thing the artificial intelligence is applied to, as opposed to, I don't know, weapons.
Hey, let Tom talk, okay?
The big change is not what we can do, but how we choose to work together, relate to each other, and collaborate together. The television did that way back half a century ago. It changed the way people relate to each other. It introduced a common reference that helped people think in similar ways. Whether that was good or not is still an open question. But the big change that I see having a huge impact is the move towards working in small groups that are able to make choices rather than working in groups that are given a task to do. because the task giver is finite, is very constrained, whereas a group of a collection of talented people who have many different skills have a very much larger capacity and capability than any individual task definer, task giver, perhaps any given leader can possibly do. So the big disruption that I see is the devolution to giving small groups pieces of a problem to collaborate on.
And for me, I'd like to pick on that. So kind of what I was hearing when you said about television and phones and the social impact on that. And I think this is kind of really, really important. And also maybe how other technologies will have an impact on our social structures around us. And for me, I mean, I have two daughters, 17 and 19, and they are kind of getting ready to join the workforce. And what you just said is they think different. And I think, hey, I'm agile in my mind. No, I'm old for them, and I realize in so many ways how they think and act. For Christ's sake, it's true. And I mean, which company will attract them to join and to work for them? And that's really kind of also something for me, which I think often about.
For me, and Ralph, you are older, so no, I'm kidding. I think. For me, when I think about, you know, the phone or something, I'm all about the journey, right? So if my phone could zap me over to Poland right now, I'd do it. I don't care. But there's this notion, I think, that was really important. Mary and Tom, what you brought up was this notion of choice. So the way that people have interacted, we fundamentally changed that. And so it's not even for me about 17 and 19-year-olds, but I'm really interested in what this means for kids under 10. So I think that there's a lot there in terms of what does that mean? And I think the original question was, you know, what value or what kind of companies do we want to build or something like that. I just think there's a lot in terms of thinking about consideration of the behavior that is behind the technology, which companies obviously are already doing. But, you know, thinking about what we're optimizing for is important. And then we just don't know until we know, right? But there's those considerations, and I think what will be interesting as we see society become more tribal, and you know, there's different cultures. I'm Asian American, but the things that are important to me are: can we still have that community vibe? Can we still work in teams? Can we still think about the mission and the values that we stand for? And for me, you know, what does that integrity look like is quite important.
Joe, do you want to add anything to that, except that you agree?
I want to strongly agree.
Okay.
Two thumbs up he gave.
So this is interesting, because starting with disruption and discussing the types of companies, we touched upon one of the aspects of change, which is how a new technology changes our social structures, the way we live our lives, and even the way we think, as Tom said. And what is interesting is also that much of that change is not what was intended by the original inventors of that stuff. They didn't predict what will happen. So that's also interesting. So we don't really know what will AI technology actually bring, and but we can be sure we'll survive that too. So that's interesting. So let's move on. Let's move on to a question from the audience. That is, I think it's an FAQ, but I would like to hear what you want to say about it. Is what would you say to people who say Agile is just a temporary fad? It will pass and something new will appear.
I'd love to take that if I can. Value-based systems last for as long as that branding is useful. So if it's a value, the value endures. The value is timeless, and the branding is what lets you refer to it. And it's only, is that branding useful to you? Is that branding useful to the people you're trying to communicate with? And as long as that branding is valuable, that name for those values will endure, because the values themselves always endure. Specific recipes, specific frameworks are by nature transient. They're necessary because otherwise values are unapplicable. A value is the application of a value is transient by nature, like a framework. Because a framework isn't a value system. A framework is an application, an implementation. So those are always going to change. And if you have flexible branding of a framework, like some people that make some frameworks claim the framework is different every few months so that the applications continue to renew. And as long as that branding still communicates the values underneath, go for it. It works. So any application, any implementation is timed, will expire, has limited applicability. The values behind are by definition timeless, and the words we use to refer to those, as long as it has value. Now, I don't mind the word agile at all as a brand. The values under it are really cool for someone like me who likes a rate of change that's centered around the customer and embraces people as full humans at work. That nourishes me. And so the name Agile, I have no issue. And as far as I'm concerned, that can last another millennia. That's just fine, because the values underneath are important to me. Now, some people, the impression of a brand changes. Some people will start to associate agility with specific frameworks, specific applications. And I don't blame them at all for that. It's supernatural. If that happens a lot, it will become dated to the point that it's no longer valuable. It won't have utility. And if that is happening, we'll have to discard the word agile and find a different branding word for the same values, because those values endure.
Well,
I got applause from Mary and Tom Poppendick. This week is over.
Yeah.
If I had a mic, I'd drop it.
You can cross it off from your to-do list.
Dear life list.
Yeah.
Finished.
Anything some of you would like to add to Joe, what Joe just said?
I can't add anything. I thought that was great. Those are really good. I'll use principles and practices rather than I forget the words you use, but same concept. Frameworks and values, but same concept.
We've been around long enough that we've seen frameworks come and go. The frameworks that we're seeing as most obsolete today are not even in software. They're in management. And those are the frameworks that are being disrupted today by the pandemic. This whole sudden transition to work from home rather than work under the microscopic eye of a manager is, I think, going to be highly disruptive. Some companies are going to try and create microscopes that come out through the camera of people's workstation, and other people are going to trust their people. And I don't think you want to work for a microscope company.
Yeah, we're I didn't raise my hand, Andy, sorry. So two things is, one, if there's any available replay, I would say the only thing I would add is go back and listen to what Joe said. There's a lot in there. There's a lot like about dilution. There's a lot about principles. There's a lot about buzzwords, marketing, all that stuff. I actually know already companies, so I used to live in France. There's some companies in France where I have a friend, she was forced to go back to work, got COVID. And there was no reason she had to go back to work. I know people who are on teams where upper level management has said, you may not move to another state to be closer to your family because there's a sick person there. Even though you're remote anyways, you may not, because the moment everything opens up, I want you back in the office. And maybe that microscope idea, Tom, that would maybe make her feel more comfortable, the management, but it's crazy. It's crazy, that change thing.
Yeah, but I've seen an advertisement for a tool that actually makes snapshots of your employee screen and sends to you. So there are people already kind of profiting on that microscopic mindset. But anyway, so we move to the COVID, and no matter what happens next with the COVID itself, there will be definitely a change in how we work, and it will be more remote. How would you think the world would look like in terms of work and companies after COVID or post-COVID?
I mean, if I can step in here, you see the mountains in my background. I have this idea coming up in my head to get a small a wooden chalet somewhere there, and just live in the mountains and have a good strong internet and do most of my work from there. And once in a while, if something comes up, I'll head to town. And so this is really something I would never have thought about like a year ago, but now it's something it's becoming reality, and it's something you can really grasp essentially.
Mary?
So Twitter was 2 years into a brilliant idea by their CEO that everybody should be able to work wherever they want. And they were trying tests and stuff like that, experiments. And as the pandemic struck, they were about 3% of the workforce working from home. Inside of a week, it was close to 100. And a month later, he said, you know what? You get to choose whether or not you come back. You can plan on that now. I don't care where you live, but you can plan on staying there, or you can plan on coming back, or you can plan on half of one and half of the other. Because in a week, they implemented what they'd been thinking about for 2 years. They estimate that about 50% of the people will want to work from home, and 50% will want to be away from the kids. If you have little kids, it's way harder. And so that's what their estimate is. I know of plenty of cities that have now special deals where they will pay you to bring your job there. There's some in Vermont, by the way, in case you want to move to Vermont, you get about, I can't tell you how much, but you get some money if you move there and bring your job with you. There are cities around the world that are trying to attract remote workers because the people are quite certain that there's plenty of reason to get together. There's plenty of reason to talk to each other. Anybody who's been actually supervising remote people say, the minute there are issues of feeling isolated or something, the first thing you do is call that person up and get them into the office so they can talk to people. So you need that, but you don't need it every day. And what Twitter's trying to do is say, you guys figure out where you work the best. And we're going to spend our time figuring out how to make that possible. And I don't think they're the only company that's going to take that attitude. And the ones that do are really going to get access to some of the best people now around the world, okay, not just in their local area. And by the way, in case you feel like working for some other company, some other where, it's going to be a lot easier to find jobs at companies where you don't have to go in, except maybe occasionally, and maybe if you want to. I have a niece who is been working remotely. Now she's a fairly senior manager at a technology company in Boston, and she lives in Idaho, loves it. And she's been doing this for 5 years and is really effective. I was at her house once while she was holding some meetings. So this is definitely a viable thing, but everybody was afraid. Now they didn't have a choice, and they've discovered, hey, this isn't so bad. So.
Okay. So well, it's so good to see that you see the positive aspects of it. I would say that this whole COVID situation kind of forced us to actually experience working remotely, and it turned out it's not that bad after all, for many people at least. That's the feedback I'm getting from many people. That the universal saying is I was quite skeptical, but right now I'm quite fine with being at the office once every other week or something like that. So that's a huge change that will probably stay with us. And I have another question from the audience that is related. What will be the most valuable competence behavior in the future after COVID for Agile coaches and Scrum Masters?
Would you read that again?
Of course. What will be the most valuable competence and behavior in the future after COVID for Agile coaches and Scrum Masters?
Okay, I hit the button. I raised my hand. So I don't know, but I can tell you what we found at scrum.org. So we did some surveying with McKinsey, and there were it was about collaborative and the ability to adapt. Okay, the one that was interesting to me that came up was the notion of agreeableness. agreeableness. I'll throw that out there, agreeableness. Maybe there's things in there in the interpretation of what someone who is agreeable means, but I thought that was an interesting one that I would throw out there. I don't know if that talks about empathy or compassion, but the notion that you're agreeable to some people is negative, to some people's complacency, but it also might mean something else, that you're kind. So that's what we found recently.
Mary, Tom?
Well, I spent many, many years being very successful in careers in which there were no Scrum Masters and no coaches. And I don't have in my mental model that somebody who is not responsible for results should be a permanent fixture on teams. That's not where I came from. And so I look at a lot of teams that have the concept of responsible engineer or chief engineer. If you look at the AWS teams, they all have a leader who owns responsibility for a set of customer-based metrics that are transmitted to the teams. To me, eventually, coaches, when there's a new change, come in, help people make the change. But I've watched eventually it moves to a responsible leader who owns responsibility for results and doesn't tell people what to do, but owns responsibility for communicating constraints and gathering the team together and helping them to achieve the focused results that are necessary, whether it's a chief engineer in a system like a car or a spacecraft or something like that. So I'm just not real big on saying that I would suggest people who are coaches now think about, would they really accept responsibility for results? And would they be interested in looking for jobs where they actually own leadership responsibility for delivering results? And could they do that with a team and empower that team to figure out how to do that? Would they have the, guts to own the responsibility and bring the team along and help the team achieve great stuff? I think maybe that's what folks that are coaches now should be thinking about.
So I'd like to take a step on that as well, is that if you look at coaches, the question for me is always, is it a temporary gig or is it a long-term gig? And temporary, just going in there. And for me, this is actually a dysfunction, because if it's not really driven from the internal side of the company, the willingness to change, to do what it takes, there could be a spark in the beginning, a little bit of work with someone external to initiate everything and then get it going and then grow your own people. And that's what sustainable change is for me. And now, if you are one of those coaches who are always with the customers, dialing in every other day and talking to them, is probably will change in COVID and maybe post-COVID. But overall, for me, it's more like, does it really help in the long run if you have something like that?
Joe, I'm very, very curious what you want to say.
Well, when I worked at 3M, was saying that if you had to have consultants, you weren't doing your job. We had a very strong bias against any kind of outsiders coming in and telling us what to do. For a day or two, give us some ideas, no problem. Long-term coaching, then what's wrong with us? Because we should be able to figure out for ourselves what it is that we want to do. And actually, most companies know what's necessary. They just don't want to talk about it. They want to kind of hide it. And maybe the consultant just crutch.
This is a very interesting take on the agile coach as a permanent role then. But Joe was making all kinds of faces that I'm really curious to hear what you want to say on this.
Oh wow, I'm going to take this a pretty wide and different direction. I hope people are.
We're ready.
People are ready for this. First, the idea of a coach is that concept valuable in and of itself. If we look at pro athletes, they'll have coaches for each aspect of their training if they can afford it. And it doesn't mean the athlete doesn't know. in some cases, the athlete is highly educated and aware, but that way they don't have to be thinking at the meta level. They can be fully in, if it's physical in their body or if it's mental in their mind, on the practice, and not be worried about where in the training taxonomy am I right now, and which of these training tools that I may already know are most appropriate next. So they're doing a knowledge share. And this, by the way, is a perfect application for AI. But that type of coach, has shown enduring value at high level of performance for all professions so far, especially sports professions, but also mental development professions. So that type of coach has, I will propose, currently has utility. Then I'd like to share a personal experience. I was working with Maria Mattarelli. Maria Mattarelli is a Scrum trainer, among other things. She decided she wanted to be a model, and she did. She became an international model. She created a list of what it would require for her to achieve that aspiration of hers, and she did. And she decided she wanted to be an international DJ. She decided she wanted to play at the world's hottest clubs. And she created a to-do list of what type of network, skills, capabilities she would have to, and she did it. And she has played and continues to play at the world's hottest clubs. She is an international DJ, in addition to being actually quite good at business, and a successful Scrum trainer. And she approached me at several Agile conferences over years, saying, I like what you're doing, Joe, about these things. And I enjoyed talking to her. I was impressed by her intellect and her goals and what she'd achieved. She came to me not that long ago and said, Joe, what would happen if you put your life goals in a backlog and used Agile methods, whatever branding you want to use around it? You use these collaborative methods with a coach to help you get done stuff on your personal to-do list. And I said, I'm intrigued. What do you mean? She said, well, what does financial freedom mean to you? And what does fitness mean to you? And I tried to understand that. And then she said, here are some tools that I, as a coach, and I suddenly realized I was being coached, that I, as a coach, have developed that help you check if those are really the goals that you really care about. So let's do this. And by this point, I was very intrigued. And so I went along with it. Okay, yeah. And the method that she used for me actually was useful for me, especially at the time, to say, are these actually your goals, and to recheck your goals and then executed on them. And I achieved the fitness goal that was what I wanted. I wanted 6-pack abs. I thought that'd be cool. I got it. And I wanted $1 million US in my retirement account. And for me, that's what financial freedom was. And I got it. And I was really impressed with that type of coaching. And I'd recommend that to anyone, to engage with a coach. So it's not like you don't have to already know it. It's that there's someone who's thinking at that meta level, allowing you to focus more wholly in your mind or in your body, or both, depending on what it is you're doing, or your relationship, or whatever it is you're focused on, so that you can actually break through whatever you had put in your life, or life had put in your way, that had been preventing you up until that time. I find very high utility in that concept of a coach. Now, I'd like to wrap that by saying I completely agree with Mary and Tom Poppendick. Mary happened to be the one that said it. Tom was making eyes, and so I think he was vehemently agreeing that that if you need a consultant, what's wrong with you? Which is horrible to say, because a significant amount of my ability to earn my living is as a consultant. However, that's totally true. But if I attempt to come in and engage as saying, look, I very likely don't know anything you group of people know, but I can be focusing in this area, allowing you to focus in that area, well, then that adds value. Then to Ralph's point, which I thought was very salient, which is this short-term or is this long-term? Well, that's a utility question and a funding model question, right? That's not a coach question. I completely agree with you, Ralph. if there's a fresh ideas need, well, then short-term is all you need. If there's a long-term ideas need, then you should probably be full-time staff. So it's not a consultant, which is closer to Mary's point. Likely for financial efficiency, simply for financial efficiency. Thanks. I'll get off my soapbox.
Mary, Tom, do you want to say something to that? Because I think you wanted to say something. Yeah.
For me, it comes down to push versus pull. Pushing ideas is not very useful. Pulling ideas out of people is what gets them traction. How do you pull? You ask questions. All the way back to Aristotle. Questions are Socrates, whatever.
I think so.
All the way back
I
to
could be
Greece.
wrong.
The asking questions is the main way of coming to answers, and it's not your answers. It's the answers that come out of the individuals attempting to answer.
Socrates.
Yeah, okay. The role of coaching is to ask questions. A good coach asks good questions. Now, who gets to ask questions? We all do. We all get to coach each other. If you're in an environment where you're not permitted to ask questions, get out of it. If you're in an environment that encourages questioning each other, not saying you're wrong type of questioning, but what led you to that and why is that a better choice than something else? That kind of questioning will lead to better insight of the people into their own actions. Leadership is about asking the right questions. Followership is being open to be questioned. And we all have to remember that there are no leaders unless there are followers. We all have to learn to be good followers, or there will be no leaders. And we lead each other. That's the power of a group, the team.
So this is a great point, Tom, that I even wrote it down, that a great leader asks questions. So it's an interesting point. Patricia, Ralph, do you want to add anything to that topic?
I'm wondering if the audience is wondering, oh man, should I be an Agile coach anymore? That's what I was thinking about. There's a lot of salient things in there. I typically, I've had the experience where someone has asked if I could come in as a coach or consultant to build up a business for them. And I thought that was just ridiculous, actually. If you really believe in the ideas and we want to work together, I want to see some ownership in there. So I also feel that coaching and consulting or whatever things, sometimes I want to see how invested a company is. So I will say, I'll come in for a week. We're going to go through these things. Here are the things that we think we can work on. Go and work on those and then come back to me. I have no intention to sit there and do it for you. So that is how I would engage usually.
And I can just kind of agree totally with what Patricia said there. It's like, challenge the customer a little bit, ask them really if they want to do that, and they find it out, and don't be there all the time, hold their hands and take them along, but ask good questions and leave them there and come back in 1 or 2 weeks, a month, and see how they're doing and ask the next questions and see where they're struggling and step in if there's something you can really do for them, but otherwise be more like the observer in the background.
Okay, so we have like 4 minutes to go. And I have some questions from the audience, but one of them is pretty long, I think, which is how can we establish a culture of experimentation? It would take a long time to answer. I have a bunch of other questions which are all concentrated on Scrum, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, including what do you think when changes will be introduced in the new version of the Scrum guide? Anyone wants to comment on that one?
If anyone knew, they wouldn't be allowed to talk about it right now.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
Unraise your hand, Ralph. Unraise it, Joe.
Oh, in all seriousness, I truly enjoyed this discussion. I think we are getting warmed up really, and as I said, I even wrote down some of the points. But is there anything else you would like to say and leave our audience with? Just keep it relatively short.
You should
Anyone
have a
wants to
week, I
start?
guess. That's the takeaway.
Wait, he needs to say something, so he's on speaker view.
It's gotta be Joe.
Joe, it's up to you.
You're the best ever. I think permission to play is important. And I think understanding what makes you feel alive and engaged and exploratory is what changes our perception from disrupted to enjoying change or solving a problem. And finding that zap, the lightning of empowerment, every day if you can, every moment if you can, is what changes work to work worth doing in a way that's worth doing. And I think that is actually the most healthy, mature, and business productive personal response to COVID, to robotics, to the phone, to television, to etc. And it's how do I bring the healthiest, most loving part of me into this situation with performance that helps solve what I'm here to do. So the intersection between kicking butt and having fun is a really interesting intersection, as long as we don't tire ourselves out, right? As long as we're understanding what rest and recovery means. And I will try to sum that up as permission to play. And I think that's an important aspect at work.
Mary, Tom?
I'm not going to answer any questions on Scrum. I have no clue.
No, what I have in mind is your kind of last words on this panel, because before we move on.
So I'm about to give a keynote speech, and I think I will leave my sum up till that.
Superb. Tom?
Nothing more.
Okay. Ralph?
No, nothing more to add. I think it's 1 more minute to go, and I would call it saved by the bell.
Okay. And Patricia?
Poland is between Germany and Russia. Polish people are super resilient. Keep sharing ideas and pushing the barrier.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, as some of you might have noticed, we are nearing the end of this panel.